Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the IDA. Thank you for joining us today for what is our final conversation of this year's Awards Spotlight series around Apple's 1971, and I want to make sure that I get the full title properly. So just bear with me because I have it up here. So it's 1971's the year that music changed everything. We're very excited for this conversation. Before we begin, I would like to start, as always, with a brief land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Los Angeles, which is on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would like to offer a thanks to our media sponsor, Variety, for bringing this series to all of you this year. We're really grateful to have them on board and for all their support. And one final thank you before we go, as always, to Andrea for her ASL interpretation. We thank you for all your time this series, and we know we'll see you again soon. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to film critic Lisa Kennedy, who's going to get us started for this conversation. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, thank you, Cassidy. It's so good to see you again. And I'm so excited for this final, I'm not excited for the final part of it, but I'm excited to have the conversation with the filmmakers of 1979. Thank you so much. 79. That's when I graduated from high school, 1971. So let's introduce the team from 1971, the year that music changed everything. Let's start with the director, Asif Kapadia. He is known, of course, for this fantastic trilogy that he did that started with Senna, about the Formula One race car driver, and then Amy, the incredibly moving, illuminating documentary, BAFTA winner, Oscar winner, about Amy Winehouse, the singer Amy Winehouse, and then Diego Maradona, about the soccer player. So that's just a little bit, such a teeny bit of like the films that Asif has shared with us. So good to see you, sir.
Hi there. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to call up James Gay Reese, one of your producers on a couple of those films, as well as the Banksy documentary Exit from the Gift Shop. James Gay Reese, good to see you, sir.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having
me. Good. Well, it's good to have you here. Chris King, really well-known editor of documentaries and also executive producer on 1971. Chris, it's great to see you, sir.
Hello there, nice to be here.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And James Rogan, I cannot see you because I have too wide a screen. There we go. James Rogan is a director on 4 of the episodes in this 8-part series, and he's won a number of awards. And I think that I'm going to mention that one of the films that he directed, because I want to talk about it later, is the film Stephen. Oh, I just lost the name. I'm sorry. We'll talk about it in the conversation. Anyway, thank you, James Rogan. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So will you correct me on the name of the Stephen documentary, BBC? Because it sounded...
Stephen, the Murder That Changed a Nation.
Right. I think that we'll have a conversation a little bit about how different pieces of the work you've done before, all of you, have sort of informed some of the choices you made for this film. So that was why I really want to make sure we get to that as well. But let's talk about an 8-part series. It's a beast. How did you organize taking on that beast? Perhaps we'll start with Asif, because you've made these distinct features. And then this seems, episodic really has a different rhythm, I assume. And also it has a rhythm that goes across time, and also a rhythm that drills down into time with themes in each episode. So I'm curious, both from, as if sort of in the big picture, what were your concerns about doing this 8-part series. And then Joe, maybe we'll go to you and talk a little bit about that sort of sense of what are the rhythms, the cresting and the sort of waves of narrative energy that you were like playing with. So
Lisa, I would suggest James Gay Rees, the producer, should start
with
because
that.
he found the book, because it's an adaptation of a book. So maybe James should start and then we can take it from there.
As a director, no, even a director on it. I know it's like as a director, you are directing me to go to the producer, even though that's my second. That is my second question.
We're
director
heavy on this Q&A.
I know. So all right. So though that was a question. Let's start with that. But actually, James Gay Rees, as
Yes,
opposed to James
right.
Rogan.
Yeah.
Why did you option the David Hepworth book? I mean, what spoke to you and why did you want to option it to make it? And did you see it as a series?
Yeah, I did actually. I mean, so when his agent mentioned it to me in passing, I just thought, because when somebody says it's 1971, the music was really great that year, you're like, yeah, but I'm sure it is, because I know that period from a film and fashion and music point of view quite well. I really do love that moment in time, the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. I love it for lots of reasons. And when somebody starts reeling off those different, records to you, you're like, holy crap, all in one year, that's incredible. So, and it's even more incredible when you really get into it. So at one point, there was even an idea of doing a 12-part series. So you do a month per episode. And, the book is great. And it obviously does go chronologically, but we came up with the idea of doing it more thematically. So at one point, it was going to be 4 themes, then there were too many themes to go around. So we expanded it into 8 themes. And so some of the episodes are interrelated. Some of them are kind of, themes are broken into 2 episodes, but like it's set up and a payoff. But it just felt like, we wanted to try and do something different with the approach, to not make a sort of straightforward music doc in the normal sense, whereby you have just musicians talking about how they constructed the song. We wanted to make a series which really looks at a moment in time and the music of that moment in time, and made sense of the interplay between the two, and how society informed the music and how the music actually also informed what was happening in society. So it was that as soon as we sort of decided on that, then it was like, okay, well, what themes were emerging at the end of the 60s? Because obviously there'd been all this hope, and that quickly sort of, unfortunately sort of fell apart due to, Kent State, Altamont, the Charles Manson moments. So many things kind of crashed the end of the 60s party and replaced that energy with a sort of darker energy, which then gave rise to this enormous creative outlet and output from these different artists and different responses. So we just started looking at what themes were emerging and what we could really get hold of, and then work out what music fitted with those different themes. And that's the project. That's the show you see, is basically that, really. And obviously there was an enormous amount of debate around, the different themes and, what they were trying to say and what we were trying to say with those episodes. But we just wanted to try and do a slightly different type of documentary,
Right.
not your traditional music documentary.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's very funny because some of the reviews really get, I mean, I think that the title itself, the book's title was Never a Dull Moment, the Year Rock Exploded. Who came up with the cheeky revise of that? Because I think that has really encouraged people almost immediately be like, 1971, I don't think so. Or, oh my God, you're so correct. It's really it's kind of an amusing sort of side note to what goes on with this. But so really,
I think that might be my fault, to be honest.
I think maybe so. I'm not surprised, but I think that's very cool. That's very funny. You guys left yourself appropriately a little wiggle room in terms of like how things landed in 71, because like you said, something was sort of unraveling or changing dramatically at the end of the 60s. And I'd say, for America, those 2 assassinations in 68 were really quite sort of, that might be the end for, the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, or, or the sort of the start of this next sort of thing. But in focusing on 71, what were your rules? Because I do think that you really land on 71 every time, and I'm like, really? Oh my God, it is 71 every time you have this moment. So what were the rules of that engagement in some way?
We did think about this a lot, because we knew there's there are the most pedantic people in the world are kind of music specialists,
Yes, they are.
And and none of us are real music specialists. I mean, Chris really knows his music, and we all love our music, but where there's music intellects and academics who are kind of very rigorous about this sort of stuff. But we thought that basically either a record had to be written in 71, recorded in 71, or released in 71. Am I right, James? James Rogan is quite to blame for this slightly baggy nature of this premise, because he was like, no, it's fine. It was written in 71. We can use it. Or it was released in 71. But
Yeah,
I think
so
these were the
we argued about it. We argued about it all the time. We argued about it all the time. What were the restrictions? And it was a constant source of conversation and mirth and some sort of niggles. But the reality was that as soon as you realised that, so for example, I interviewed Al Bell from Stax, and he described writing "I'll Take You There" in 71 for the Staple Singers. He described taking it to Mavis, and Mavis bringing death to life, because he wrote at the funeral of his brother.
Right.
And they recorded it in October 71. Now, if we had said that it had to be released, it became a #1 hit in 72, then that was a sort of, that felt a bit narrow in terms of, because what we were after was the experience. We weren't after a sort of a numerical justification. We were after the experience of 71. And so, equally you had Elton John, who basically hit it big in September of 1970, and in 71 was reaping the whirlwind of that success. And he wrote Tiny Dancer in 71. Your song had been written in 70, but was charting in America in 71. So I was very much kind of like, this feels like 71, so it is 71, and we can argue the plans later.
Yeah, and if you were around in January of 1971, you would have just been listening to George Harrison, because his record was like #1. It had been #1 for ages. My Sweet Lord was absolutely everywhere. But of course, that had been recorded over the previous 2 years.
Absolutely.
And equally, if you'd spent the year with the Rolling Stones, you would then have to wait until, I think, February or possibly March of the following year, when they finished fiddling around and it was finally released to the public, even though all the major recordings were done in 1971. So there were a couple of different kind of rules that we set ourselves, but it had to predominantly land in some shape or form in 1971 in the most significant way. And that would sometimes just depend on our viewpoint.
Right.
If we were looking at how the music was received by the general public, by those listening to it, then of course you could just look at the Billboard charts and see who was #1, who was #2, who had released an album this week. If you were looking at people who were reacting to the events of the time, the musicians themselves, and what the fabric of how they were living, then there were a different set of rules entirely. So it very much depended on the perspective of that particular artist and the scene that we were looking at.
Well, how early did those conversations happen? And I think they sound like they happened over and over again in certain moments, because I think that's so rich. It's like to say, I think someone could ask, and I think it's answered to some degree, why didn't you just do the charting as a way of like speaking to sort of like popular, sort of the audience, whatever that is, what their energy was in relationship to that. And I think you have really amazingly interesting and intriguing answers to that. So like,
I could sort of speak to that a little bit, is that the nature of it was that we were talking to people whose experiences had been defined by 71. Both artists and activists and politicians. And so it was also guided by them. So it was guided by what was big for them. So the charts is one reflection of what was big, but the experience of 71 was also guided by the fact we were having these long conversations with people. And so, for instance, talking to Brian Jackson, who was, co-writing with Gil Scott-Heron at the time, I was just saying, do you feel this is a 71 track? And he's like, well, absolutely, it's a 71 track. Because it was April, that I went into the studio and did this and did that and did the next thing. And so there was a kind of a dialogue about that. The Last Poets was a good example where Abayadin basically said to me, he said, look, we released Last Poets in 70, but it made massive waves in 71. And then I went and interviewed Martha Reeves, and she was like, I'm telling you, Marvin Gaye was listening to Last Poets, and Berry Gordy was saying about what's going on, don't give me the Last Poets for Motown. Like this isn't what
This is not
we're
our
about.
doing.
So that synchronicity, those connections were as important as a sort of a strict sort of sense of 71. Was it number one in 71? Because of course, some of those records were underground records that were bubbling up and up and up and had their moment in 71.
Well, I think that's such an interesting answer, in part because what it does is remind us, I mean, and this is the shift I'm really intrigued by too, is that it's about the generative sort of energy of a moment, not sort of only the sort of market, the Billboard charting thing would be sort of the marketplace moment of the how it's received. That doesn't mean it isn't important or it isn't sort of rich in its own right, but there's something that you all were doing about sort of the generative relationship of the artist to the moment and the moment to the artist, this like ongoing sort of biofeedback, this sort of feedback loop that I think is really complex. And I think you'd almost have to have themes in order to sort of make it sort of track through. But what did you all, what did you learn about creativity? I know that seems sort of broad, but you have a lot of different artists talking and speaking about creativity and the relationship to a moment. But so I'm interested in like, what did you learn about creativity and sense of like your subjects? And also, what did you learn about creativity and the sense of your putting together this work as artists yourselves, as film producers and directors and editors? What did you learn about creativity? Anything new, something open up differently than it had before in the process?
I think just in relation to the first part of the question, I mean, because it was such a sort of weird crux of a year, there was all this kind of confusion flying around, and there was that definitely a tonal shift towards a slightly more sort of paranoid sensibility. And just think, just when over the course of the series, and obviously, there are certain artists we left out as well because we just had to stop somewhere, right? But we couldn't go on forever. But just the way that different people reacted in different ways to that moment, I think is really interesting. It's very hard to believe that you've got Marvin Gaye and Ziggy Stardust in the same year. Do you know what I mean? They're coming at
Right.
such ends of the spectrum, both equally genius, but like seeing the world in very different ways, obviously in different moments and responding in different ways. And obviously Marvin writing about a very direct experience in terms of what was happening in his country, and almost like Ziggy Stardust being this alien creation that's looking at all this fractured landscape, this entirely fractured landscape, trying to work out his place in the world, trying to work out, because he couldn't really get his creative mojo to hit the target, but slowly all the pieces start to fall into place for him, and he creates this new alter ego that's like from outer space basically, and the kind of popular culture but arguably never the same again. But it was just that was just so fascinating, just looking at all the different responses to the moment, and because that's partly why I think the show sustains, is because it's not just all about urban music. It's not all just about singer-songwriters. It's not all just about people looking forward. Everything's coexisting and bouncing off each other. And I just love that thing when you're watching the series, like, God, this is all happening in the same year. That
Right.
seems to me. And I think, it's instructive. We're in a challenging moment again now. And it's going to be interesting to see how art responds to that, and how the creative process, as you say, is impacted by the challenges we face today. And I hope that it's as kind of fruitful as 1971.
Yeah, that would be.
Lisa, I was going to say something about,
yes,
when
of
you talk
course.
about the nature of kind of creativity. What I think is interesting is that talking a lot of this is like pop music, which at the time is
Right.
meant to be kind of disposable. Song comes out, you make another one, and it comes up on the radio and it's gone. And the idea that 50 years later, these songs and these lyrics and these artists are so on point with what was going on in the world now while a series was being making is what I think is really interesting about an artist who's been very specific about a moment and a time or something personal to them, has no idea what it's going to mean to a generation later, but it lands. In fact, maybe it means more. And I think that's what I think is so powerful. It's about how contemporary it all feels. A lot of the process of what we do in the films that we've made before in this series is about making us feel like we're in the present. The idea isn't to be looking backwards and forwards in time and cutting between people talking now and people then. We put you in the moment, you're in the present, you're meant to feel like what it's like to be in 1971 in New York or LA or London. But it's so relevant to what was going on in the streets in the US and what was going on in the UK. I think that's, I suppose, the nature of kind of artistry and creativity and people who don't know what they're making at the time. And
Right.
We're still kind of understanding it. We're still unraveling it now all these years later.
I know. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think that, so maybe you said it because, and I'm just going to quote you from the Variety interview that you had. It was just like, because the 60s don't feel like the way we're living right now. The beginning of the 70s leads to everything that we're dealing with now and the artists we're listening to now. And I do think that a lot of us have felt, especially if you had lived any little teeny part of that, and I was really very young when all this sort of stuff, or fairly young when all this stuff happened in the 70s that you're talking about, that that it's sort of extraordinary to have the same issue. I mean, and it really is, you can just sort of check off stuff. I mean, if, you know, we can sort of put it in the lens of like identity politics to some degree, sort of Black Lives Matter issues, feminism, Me Too, all those things were sort of roiling again in a very profound way. And it makes me think that you too also learned something. I mean, it's like that little sort of James Baldwin plus ça change moment where you're like, oh my God, we're still stuck there. And that might be because we have a very sort of particular and also sort of humankind vision, which is still pretty teeny compared to, you know, whatever, the Anthropocene or whatever like that. It's just like there's something about this moment that feels so connected to that moment. And I wonder if you think there are a different set of, sometimes I think it's like Groundhog Day and there's just a different set of lessons that we haven't learned yet. And therefore we have to return to things that are like, oh, this is so similar to the, you know, the beginning of the 70s in terms of both possibility, but also in terms of trauma. I think we have a new word we use a lot more than we had before, which is trauma. And I'm wondering, just as people who care, what do you feel like? Are there lessons? I mean, you know, I don't think as filmmakers, probably you don't sort of set out thinking, what's the lesson of this, or do you?
I think there was definitely early on when we were reviewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of material for every single story, for every single potential storyline, for every single potential character that was in there. There were so many moments where you would see a piece of news footage or another clip of archive and just think, that's amazing. That could be on a news station now, right now, from any number of the topics that you suggested and numerous others as well. And then, as you say, often a few minutes later, you think it would be quite dispiriting to realize that, because you think it still hasn't, it's still, how far have we moved? I mean, it's amazing to think that people were so, maybe that was the point, a point where people were galvanized to start talking about things in a different way. And that's why it feels so relevant. And I think certainly for the musicians, the musicians felt they had a voice in a different way that I think that perhaps musicians do nowadays. Because music was viewed in a different way, I think it was the main cultural commodity of the day. It was the big medium by which all that countercultural generation spoke to one another and listened and found out about things. There's one of the contributors who referred to it as a kind of like the newspapers. People didn't read the mainstream newspapers. They didn't necessarily watch the mainstream television news. They got what they needed, the information they needed about what was going on, literally from the records that they were buying. And I think the artists understood that, and understood that they were speaking to quite a wide number of people, big number of people who would understand them, who would receive what they were going to say, and therefore really thought about what they were going to write and their lyrics and what that meant and how that would affect things, whether it was a reflection, stories about the street, or bigger issues that needed raising, or direct protest songs. They knew that there was a massive audience out there who needed this information. And so I think there was an urgency as well in quite a lot of the artists about what they said and how they said it, given the understanding that it was going to fly out there and millions and millions of people were relying on it to guide them in their lives at that time.
Right. Oh, I think that's really fascinating, because one of the things that sort of strikes me almost immediately is there, you know, I have friends, and you probably do as well, that sort of talk about the gift economy, this sort of like idea of sharing. And in a good day, they talk about it in relationship to social media, but we know how that hasn't really worked out quite. But the actual like sort of that period of time when people did hand each other, you know, it's like, have you listened to this? Have you heard this? I mean, there really was a kind of like social gifting of ideas.
It was
and
physical
music
as well.
It was physical. Isn't that amazing?
Thing that is precious. Look after it. Don't scratch it. It's different, isn't it?
It is very different. But
I love watching all those people rushing around Tower Records. And, like getting armfuls of albums and then going home and like inviting their friends around to listen to it, because that's the only way you're going to listen to this. And
absolutely.
It's new releases.
When we started, one of the things I said to James Gay Rees and Danielle Peck, the series producer, is that obviously I will need to have all the records. and this was met with great sort of slight mirth. I think Danielle was perplexed, and James was sort of humouring, and of course a few weeks later all the records started to arrive, and it was around Christmas time, and and it was just what a Christmas. Every other day I'd be like, oh, it's Hunky Dory, it's just arrived, and it's now it's What's Going On, or but the point was that I really wanted to put them on the record player and look at the notes and have that physical experience, and really and also have the problem of my kids running in and out, and my wife occasionally saying, do we have to listen to that again? And that kind of, that feeling of it, because I think if you can connect with the kind of the physical experience of something, it's a good first step. And it's, even though Spotify and listening to, I did also listen to a lot of music online, is good. That just that mental process of going to the cupboard, pulling out the sleeve, putting it on, putting the pin, flipping the side, was actually very useful, because when I was speaking to people, that was how they had listened to the music, and that was how they experienced it. And they would talk about ending a song or a record being damaged, or hearing it in a certain way on a certain bandwidth of radio, and that was all very, very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think of filmmakers who work with archival images, and as people who are the beneficiaries of a kind of surveillance, and surveillance has become self-surveillance, or in the case of COINTELPRO, sort of these other kinds of surveillance have going on. I wonder what you have learned or what you gleaned about, I think there is actually good surveillance and bad surveillance probably, and then in between. But I'm wondering, that is one of the things we've returned to as a conversation, is what was going on with COINTELPRO, what was going on with the government's use of surveillance and sort of these, and then also having a lot of images that you are able to use to make us smarter about a moment in history. So it seems like an interesting tension for filmmakers who work with the archives. I mean, do you all feel that? I mean, are there sort of both insights and challenges, ethical challenges, artistic challenges to how you employ or leverage archival footage, images?
I can start, and then you guys can carry on. I mean,
Wonderful.
You start by just saying, we need to see everything. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of people, and you just have to, we've made a few of these types of films in the past, so we know how to do it, and we know it works, and we know the payoff is amazing if you spend the time and the effort and the money, I guess, on it. But it just means looking and being flexible and being aware of, you may not find everything, but something else may turn up that's incredible. So I think that process has been kind of good to us in the past, and it's been a real challenge. But when you go for it and you kind of love it, the challenges that come out of it, I think the payoff is far more amazing than the kind of more traditional talking heads cutting to something. That's something that we essentially have tried to break with all of the work that we've done in the past. Right. And I think this is they're taking it to another level because of the number of characters, the number of stories, and the distance in time we're going back. But I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of follow on with that.
Well, could I just ask one quick follow-up, which would be, what are some of the things that you took away from? I mean, because I sometimes think that that skill set is a progression, and you get better and better at understanding how you want, what you don't want to do again with archival, or what you don't, or how you want to shape it, or what you want to push. So it's a little bit of that creativity question, which is, with Senna, Amy, and the Maradona, what did it prepare you for, and what did it not prepare you for in terms of a project this sort of vast?
I mean, James, producer James, has been always very good at knowing that it takes a lot of time. You need time to do the research. They take a long time, these things, to make, and you need a brilliant group of researchers who we should mention, and then you've got to be able to react to the things that come and keep asking questions, and people go and people come. But that team of researchers just working away, digging, and finding the cupboard that's got the stuff. It's out there somewhere, and you trust it. And I think James Gay Rees can talk for himself, but basically he knew that the 70s New York or America, that's going to look great. So it's just finding that material. It's a particularly beautiful moment kind of in our brains of what time looked like. London doesn't look as great. The UK isn't
Looks
as
a little
glamorous.
sad.
Let's see. It is sad. But yeah, I think that's that process of knowing how long it's going to take, and years. These shows and films take years to make, and I think once you know that and you put the money aside to do that, I think then you can be creative.
Gotcha.
And I think also we from doing those other films, you realize that sometimes what looks pretty unprepossessing to start with can actually turn out to be wonderful if you just find the right moment for it, and then you're confident enough to flex it in the right way. And maybe a little bit of actuality, even if it doesn't have sound on it, and a couple of photographs can actually go a long way. If you have a great piece of audio interview, and a bit of music, all of a sudden you have the makings of a little sequence. And that's where, you know, James with his editor and all the other editors on the show, you toil for a long time, and it's quite an organic thing of just playing and working things around, and try it this way, try it that way, intercut the photo, no, there's numerous ways that you can approach it, and then eventually you find this kind of mosaic effect that begins to work and begins to make sense of what you've got, and looks like it was a documentary waiting to be made at the time, whereas in fact it's a little bit of a CBS News clip, it's a personal photograph, it's this and this, and somehow you make that feel like it's an authentic little snapshot of what was going on in that year that's live and isn't just a nostalgia fest, you know, where you're just seeing artifacts from the moment, which is a whole different thing.
It's like,
I would say also, I mean, Danielle Peck was a serious producer and director for the films. He did an enormous amount of thinking and, you know, kind of making on this. I think, I mean, she went down lots of rabbit holes as we both did, and you almost have to imagine where the cameras might be, because there are some people that, you know, Lennon filmed everything, so you know that you've got a big pool of archive and you can use that as a base to kind of move on and off from. But I know with Bowie, there wasn't much archive of him in that year. And so there was a lot of excavation and detective work to try and find stuff. And you really have to kind of think as laterally as possible and kind of spread bet in a way. You sort of bet where there might be stuff, and then you go after it hard. And as you're making it, we don't script the films, but as you're making it, you've got a feeling of like, you know, I want this track to land and I'm going to need that kind of footage. And even if I only have 2 stills of Marvin, the combination of these 3 things, as Chris says, will make it work as long as I find X, Y, and Z. And so you're on this kind of constant process of imagining what would be your best case scenario and then trying to work towards it.
But basically, you know, if you make a film, if you decide to make the films without any voiceover or any talking heads, it's not an easy way to make a film. Do you know what I mean? There are no shortcuts. And so you have to make the pictures work and you have to make the sync audio work. But it definitely makes it challenging. But as Asif said earlier, but the payoff is great when it comes together. There's nothing like it because it's so immersive when you don't cut in and out of it, you know.
Yeah, and you kind of wreck it for other documentary filmmakers, by the way, because I do think that our expectations as films have become sort of that they flow in this way, that they evolve, that you feel more immersed in the time period when you watch something that probably doesn't have the resources and doesn't have the time and hasn't planned it out quite as well. It feels lesser, and it's an interesting challenge. I mean, it bumps up the whole game. I mean, that's why we're ending with you all to some degree. It's like, you know, it bumps up the game for people. James Rogan, one of the things that Chris said that I thought was interesting was just this sort of notion of, you know, trying to find the right energy, the right moment, the like sort of the right juxtaposition, the right sort of overlapping, all that stuff. Do you have like some specific moments where, I know it's like you are not the kind of person who goes, yes, but did you have some of those moments where you were like, yes, we got it kind of thing? Or did you feel like there were a few of those where it looked like it was going to be hard to turn that? I mean, I think it happens a lot. You know what you want, you think you can get there, and then you're working at it, and then there's a turning of the corner, and the turning of the corner is a real thing for, I think, all of you probably. I'm wondering if there's some moments that you could be specific about in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, firstly, for me, the interview process with the contributors is really important. So whatever I feel when I'm interviewing the person, I'm trying to recreate that experience in the film, and that's my benchmark to the frustration sometimes of the editors. But a good example of a moment was as soon as the penny dropped that John Lennon was recording Imagine at pretty much the same time Nixon was recording himself in the Oval Office and installing his recording equipment. I was like, okay, well, this is just fantastic. You've got these two of the most famous people in the world, both recording each other for themselves for posterity, one writing songs, one making history. And could we juxtapose those things? And so you go, well, who in Nixon's office will tell us about it? So we eventually, the producer, James Bellardi, and the research team found Alexander Butterfield, and he agreed to speak. And so suddenly you're in San Diego speaking to the assistant to Nixon and getting a completely candid download on what it was like to be in the room. And he helped actually install the recording device.
Right,
so that was mind-blowing. And then on the other side of it, you've got Lennon recording Imagine and inviting Tariq Ali, a well-known radical leftist at the time, to come over and test his political philosophy off against Tariq Ali. So you're having that conversation in London, and you're just thinking, this is just this incredible duality of experience. And I know that if I can deliver those two things in the film, there'll be something really special about that. Two men recording themselves for completely different reasons. Both recordings will change history. What could be more exciting than that?
That's wild, and it really works well. I think, speaking of Lennon, I mean, and I started to smile when you were talking about how much he had photographed himself, like had documented himself. It's just like it's like, yeah, he was on the pot. That is pretty funny. But that there's that moment where Phil Spector is in the sound booth, and I'm like, how do you, I mean, because I think that you have some very clear ideas about what you wanted to do in terms of time. So how do you guys did you or what kind of conversations do you have when you're like, oh, this is 40 years from now, this is not going to end well, sort of. I mean, it's like, I just think there must be some moments where it's like, how do you repress the future, the future you understand, our present, in relationship to this past? And were there instances where you didn't entirely want to do that? You wanted to cheat the present, cheat towards the present just a little bit because so that's the question. I mean, I have to feel that your sort of thoughts about time and future and past and present were consistently, sort of engaged. So
I can say something general,
wonderful.
And then maybe you guys can go into detail. I just think one of the powers of this style of filmmaking is the layers that you have built into the work of art that you create. And the idea, because we haven't really talked about all of the non-musical iconic characters that are in the series who help you understand when a moment in time one episode crosses another episode. So whether it's Charles Manson or Andy Warhol or Muhammad Ali having a fight with Joe Frazier, and I'm a big fan of Ali, so I would know that fight, but not knowing that these events were happening at the same time as that fight. All of these people run through the series, and they could have an entire series made just about them. But in this sort of style of series, they're just the character that our musicians or our artists or our creative people pass by or through, that give you another little layer of, oh, that's where we are in time. Oh, that's where we are in time. So I think the idea of Phil Spector being there, I don't think anyone was censoring who was in there, but you realize, oh, that's Spector. I know about him. He did something 45 years later, whatever it was. He just died. A lot of characters died during the making of the series, actually. That was the other thing that was going on. You're making something, you go, Bill Withers just died, or, things like that are happening. You realize that's why this series is also so important. But maybe the rest of them can carry on some of the choices that were in there.
We did speak about Phil Spector, and obviously was it controversial to include him, and because of what happened later. But he was in the room, and he was there, and he was integral to Imagine. And so we weren't wanting to rewrite him out of the history. And in some ways, it as Asif says, it adds a layer that people bring to it. Lennon, Spector is an imperfection, and that it's not as simple as all the people in the music industry were saints and everyone else was sinners. It's real life.
Right.
Yeah, and equally, when we were looking, the Manson case ran through the first part of that year, and obviously, Roman Polanski was Sharon Tate's partner, husband. I don't know if they were married, actually, partner, I think. We know what happens with Roman Polanski and the contemporary controversies about him, but
Right.
that wouldn't mean that we would excise him from 1971 if necessary, if it was necessary to have him in there because of what we subsequently found out about him. All that we could focus on was the time frame that we were working within and what impact these characters had and how useful they were to our story within that time frame of 1971.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have a question. Do you think of, did you all think of, having done such great character-driven documentaries, that trilogy, did you think of like time as 1971 the character? I mean, and if so, how does that work? Or did you not go that way? That was not how you sort of conceptualized it. I know that there's thematic things to help, but was like 1971 a character? I mean, how did you conceive of that?
I think Danielle was really good on this. I think the
Mhm.
idea of how it wasn't going to be, as James mentioned, it wasn't going to be like the book, which was chapters and going through it month by month, but kind of being more thematic. And yeah, it is all the character is 1971. It's the mood of the times, isn't it? It's about everything that's going on in the ether that year and just before and just after. But yeah, I think the idea that makes it so strong and so difficult and so challenging is it's not about one person and one character in their life, but all of these people crossing paths and meeting or not meeting, but somehow bouncing off one another.
Right,
Remember
right. Well,
James
that is,
Rogan-
oh, sorry, go ahead,
So I
please.
remember James Rogan saying in one of our early development meetings, the way that we should look at it is that basically it's this massively transitional moment where everything that's good about the world came out of that moment, and everything that's maybe not so good about the world also came out of that moment, you know. And that's just obviously one way of looking at it, but it definitely helps when you're making such a big unwieldy project to kind of have that sort of premise in your mind when you're looking at the events and trying to work and trying to make sense of everything. So if it's very helpful to kind of have a simple lens like that sometimes.
Absolutely.
And crucially, to begin this whole process, you need questions in your mind, big questions and many, many small questions. Because with these kind of big archive projects, a lot of it is like detective work. So you're asking questions constantly. What was in the water that year? Why did he record that? Why were people saying that? And when you begin with a question, the film provides the answer. And that's hopefully what the process develops in the end.
And
Well,
I would add to
Mhm.
that as well, is that if you think about the culture of that moment, what the music was saying, there was an urgent expression that had to happen. You know, there was an urgency to it. The songs were mostly written quite fast. It was in the moment, and so the lifeblood of the project was always the music. It's like whenever you were in doubt, and I mean Acid said this frequently, and we all said a variation of it frequently. Whenever you were in doubt, you went back to the track. And for me, for the track to be in, I had to love it and feel it and want it to be in. And then we would debate, you know, and James would say a lot, well, where's Inner City Blues? And Inner City Blues would be in and out because, you know, brilliant track, but it was hard to cut in the nature of the film. But that feeling of the music, that sort of pulsating feeling of like, I have to listen to this. And I have all the film soundtracks on, you know, on my phone, and I listen to them still all the time.
Wow,
because they became, it was such a tumultuous year, the last year that we made it, that it was like a lifeline. Like it was like holding on to something. You could see how it worked in the time. You know, when Aretha sings, I mean, I was on a panel with Steve McQueen the other day, and he was saying Aretha saved lives. Aretha saved lives. I mean, I would say that she's still saving lives. People are still holding on to that music every day as just a sort of like an anchor within a sort of tumultuous, strange world. And so many, Bowie, Lennon, the Stones, all for different people, sometimes the same people, different ways. That music, you could just hold on to it. And making it when we did, when everything was in flux, it was like this beautiful release, this balm in a kind of very, very stormy, crazy time.
Yeah, no, well said. And I actually think I see that we're kind of at the end of our conversation, and worse things that could happen than we end with Aretha saves lives is still saving lives. I will not disagree with that at all. I love that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for an amazing film. I'm sorry Danielle's not with us, because then it would be like, thank you all, and not gentlemen. And congratulations on a really remarkable series. Thank you for reminding us of I think I like the idea of like what was great and also what was really painful that we still have to work our ways through. So
Okay.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.